I'd just like to take this opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Jeremiah DeGullen, and I'm a solutions advisor with the Center for Professional and Executive Development. We partner with individuals and organizations to enhance performance through professional development programs, certificates, coaching, consulting, and assessments. Professional development programs are delivered on-site at the Fluto Center in beautiful downtown Madison, and we now offer online programs facilitated by our instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations throughout the country to provide customized on-site and online programs, coaching and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. So now let me introduce you to our speaker. Shawn Belling is a globally experienced technology executive, project management speaker and instructor, and author based in Madison, Wisconsin. Shawn has held executive and management roles in higher education, software, consulting, biopharma, manufacturing, and regulatory compliance sectors. In addition to over 28 years of technology and project leadership experience, Shawn teaches, speaks, and consults for businesses, universities, and professional organizations. Shawn released his book, Succeeding with Agile Hybrids, in November of 2020, and is preparing to release his second book, Remotely Possible, this summer. Shawn, thank you for joining us. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Welcome everyone to our second in the series of webinars on remote work. The title of our webinar this afternoon is You Can't Herd Electric Sheep, Leadership in a Post-COVID Environment. And the title is, for those of you who are Blade Runner fans, a bit of a nod to the book on which that movie was based. So this afternoon, when we get into talking a bit about what leadership is going to look like as we start to transition back into a post-COVID environment, there are a few key takeaways we hope we can provide you with this afternoon. One is to give you some sense of skills that are valuable and necessary to be successful in leading remote and remote hybrid teams. Related to that, skills to look for, characteristics to look for when you are interviewing and hiring people who may be part of your remote teams, your remote distributed teams, geographically distributed teams. And lastly, to give you some techniques to help you as leaders and to help be coaches to leaders and managers who will be supervising remote or remote hybrid teams and groups. Our outline for this afternoon, we're going to start by talking a bit about how remote scenarios require different thinking, different leadership styles, different techniques, and how that differs perhaps from other approaches that some may be used to. We're going to talk a little bit about certain management theories, specifically on theory X and Y in contemporary times. We'll touch upon some specific approaches to help leaders and their teams thrive in a remote hybrid environment. And we'll talk a bit about specific techniques that are useful when you're leading and managing or working on remote distributed teams. And then, as noted a little bit earlier, we make sure we reserve some time for Q&A. That's always the fun part, is getting a chance to dialogue and field some questions. Before we get into the topic matter, we find it interesting to get a sense of what everybody is thinking about when it comes to, again, I've taken to calling this the great return, and I don't know if I've coined that phrase or what, but interested, we're going to pop up a poll here, and we would like to see what your current plans are for remote work. Are you looking at providing maximum remote flexibility? Are you looking at some kind of a hybrid of remote and on-site work? Or are you looking at maximum return to having people physically in the office? So we're certainly interested in your feedback and encourage you to complete the poll. All right, well, hopefully everybody can see the results. Just under 20% looking to provide maximum remote flexibility, 67% doing some kind of a hybrid, and smallest percentage, 14%, looking for maximum return to being physically in the office. And just kind of riffing on the poll here for a second, obviously there are many factors that influence an organization's thinking on this approach. Everything from the type of business or the vertical that you are in, things like organizational culture that has a huge impact on things. We'll talk a bit about that. And there are just so many different individual scenarios that can impact this. But it's always interesting to see where people are coming from. And consistent with most of the conversations that I've been having with people and other surveys and other data that I've seen, that hybrid remote seems to be where the world is headed. So how are we going to be successful in this environment? And I want to start with a story that goes back to pre-COVID times, phrase that we wouldn't have anticipated using not all that long ago. This gets back to a conversation I was having with a leadership team in December of 2019. This leadership team was working on what they were at the time quaintly calling teleworking policies. And the conversation around, how should we be building these? What should they look like? What will we, how will we structure this? One of the directors made a comment about how they would look at providing the telework policy and making it available to specific people but not others, because in the words of this director, they felt like they could trust a particular person when they could see them, but they wouldn't trust them to get things done when they were out of sight. And I was really struck by that conversation, and I stopped the conversation and I said, that's not a telework, that's not a remote work problem, that's a hiring problem. You created this issue when you hired somebody that you don't trust. And we need to look at everything through that lens. It's a really important starting point. We'll talk a bit more about that as we get deeper into this. In contemporary times, 2021 and forward, the leader who thinks in terms of, I trust my people and I'm most comfortable when I can literally see them working. When the leader who is really thinking about, I want to see butts in seats. That's how I lead. That's the kind of organization that I feel most comfortable leading, and that's what I want. You are probably in the wrong decade, and it may be time for you to consider a career change. And I'm serious. This is just not an effective way of leading at this point in time, especially not after the global experiment that we've just been through. Instead, we need to be thinking about leadership models in remote hybrid scenarios that start first and foremost with trust, fostering trust, giving trust, building cultures and leadership styles that assume that people are going to do what needs to be done, holding them accountable, and not relying on physically or even digitally seeing that people are doing things. We want to build cultures and work scenarios and structures where it's the results that count, what people are getting done. It's not about how much face time, how much desk time, how often are you in the office, or even how much meeting time, how often do I see that your calendar looks busy or that you've got a Zoom or a Teams call scheduled. It's not about that. Don't conflate or confuse results with face time, with meeting time, with desk time. It's a really important concept to get our minds around as leaders. And it may seem obvious to some, but there's plenty of literature already, written in the first 6 months of 2021, that as we start to think about returning in different forms, that is something that is engendering concern, that we may see some potential inequities and some perception that, hey, the people that are coming into the office are somehow working harder and more deserving of promotions than the people who are continuing to work remote. It is critical to get out in front of that and not allow that to happen. It's just not an acceptable way to lead if that's the environment you want to create with remote hybrid work. When you're thinking in terms of people, and specifically as you're thinking about hiring decisions going forward, and this was true before the pandemic, this is not a new thing, this should not be a new concept in any way, but it's critical that when you hire, you're hiring people you trust across the room or across the country. that should be a standard of thinking that we apply when we're looking at people potentially joining our organization in this remote and remote hybrid world that we're going to see. Another important thing to consider is how the whole model and concept of what or who an effective leader looks like or is. And I want you to stop and think for a second. Just stop and consider what model or what kind of person jumps into your mind in a pre-COVID, primarily on-site leadership role. You know, what sort of qualities would we ascribe or expect from a person who we sort of stereotype as, well, they're an effective leader? You know, very often, and I know I have looked at it through this lens myself, and sometimes even describe people and modestly, situationally even describe myself in this way. The dynamic front of room person who can get on the balcony, if you will, and through either positional power or in some cases charisma, charm, style can, you know, act as and be perceived as an effective leader. When we're looking at remote work environments, that sort of leadership style just doesn't count for a lot. And so, you know, what we've already seen, and again, this is something that organizations that were already working remote before the pandemic are already highly familiar with. We began to see this on a much larger scale as we have this massive global experiment during the pandemic, that in a remote scenario, it's getting things done, the ability to help others get things done that really translates into effective leadership. So the leader that we expect to see effective in remote and remote hybrid scenarios is the reliable collaborative impediment remover, somebody who is both trusted and trusting, somebody who is emotionally, culturally aware, they're building respectful and caring relationships with their teams. In other words, we're talking about the classic servant leader. Again, people who are really oriented towards planning, connecting teammates with their help and resources that they need, keeping an eye on upcoming work, but again, focused on getting things done. These are goal-focused leaders, people who are productive, dependable, and helpful. And it's more about doing things than saying things. And again, you know, this model of a leader who, as a servant leader, sees themselves, their most important role as enabling others is another lens through which to look at this, and we expect to see as a very effective leader. The ability to inspire something often called swift trust, and then foster that in others. Swift trust is something I talk a bit more about in the book. The idea that a group of people may join a team, they may never have met one another before, they're going to be working remotely, and how do you establish that trust, that you have a shared vision, shared objective, the appropriate talents and capabilities, and you are indeed ready, willing, and able to work with one another to achieve that vision and get that work done. That's a quick definition of swift trust. And again, the effective leader in remote and remote hybrid environments is that leader who can help foster and inspire swift trust. I want to talk a little bit about management and leadership theories in contemporary times and touch upon a couple of fairly well-known approaches to this and kind of illustrate what's going to work and what's not going to work. Many of you are probably familiar with Theory X and Theory Y. And again, recognizing that this is something of an oversimplification for our purposes here in the webinar, but it'll work. Theory X basically describes a leadership style where a manager approaches leadership from the perspective that people really don't want to work. It's not something people want to do, and therefore management involves managing and motivating by providing rewards for working and negative consequences and even punishments for not working and not getting work done. In other words, it's what some of us might call classic micromanagement. We have the Theory Y leader who takes a completely different view. The Theory Y leader takes the view that people actually enjoy work, that work is a natural, normal, productive part of being a human. It's, if we go over to Maslow and the hierarchy of needs for a second, it is part of self-actualization. People find satisfaction and self-expression in their work, and therefore it's not about rewarding them for doing it or punishing them for not doing it. It's about creating environments in which people feel empowered and have impediments removed to do their best work and to derive that satisfaction from working. The reason this is important in a remote or hybrid remote scenario is, in a nutshell, Theory X leadership is destructive in remote scenarios. Micromanagement is destructive. And so when we think about leadership going forward, and we think about being effective, you have to really do some self-reflection, develop some self-awareness. Are you indeed a Theory X leader? And if that's the case, you have to ask yourself why that is, and you have to ask yourself, is this approach, is this leadership style going to be valid and effective in the modern knowledge and technology-oriented workplace, in the remote hybrid workplace that we are looking forward to in the coming years? If it's the organization itself, if your organization tends towards Theory X, if that is built into your organizational culture, again, this sense of, hey, we got to keep an eye on people, we got to, micromanage them. If I can't see them, and know that there are consequences for not getting things done, it's not going to get done. If that's your organizational culture, you've got to recognize up front that that culture could very likely be a limiting factor to your success in the long-term adoption of remote work, hybrid, distributed models. It's just not a culture that's set up for success. You think about organizations that are born as remote organizations. You think about startups. You think about, in the book, I talk about some examples that I've personally been part of, or organizations that make really, really good case studies because they've been almost exclusively remote for their entire existence, in some cases going back 15 years or more. This Theory Y leadership, this trust in people and the expectation that people indeed enjoy their work and they do so for reasons beyond just avoiding punishment, it's baked into the culture of the company. It's in their DNA from day one. Another thing that we see is common to these types of organizations, of course, are highly motivated founders, and the early employees tend to be highly motivated as well, also sharing that Theory Y leadership DNA, in that, again, we assume that people want to work. This is self-expression, this is motivating, we derive self-actualization from working, and so whatever it is that we're doing it not just to get some of our most basic needs met, but because we really like it. And that's the type of organization, and that's the type of leadership theory, leadership style, that's going to really help organizations evolve towards successful adoption and widespread implementation of remote work and remote hybrid work scenarios. So again, think about this. If you yourself are a Theory X leader, or your organization has a strong Theory X culture, this is something that you're going to need to think about and work on as you potentially pivot and adopt long-term remote work. So let's touch upon a few potential approaches that could help organizations as they seek to grow and thrive in the remote work setting. I'm going to dive into another management theory, actually motivational theory, Hertzberg's hygiene theory. When we talk about hygiene, we're not talking about the cleanliness of a workplace, but rather we're talking about factors or elements that, if they're not present, they could create problems, create issues, create dissatisfaction. Conversely, when these elements are present, they will indeed help to create satisfaction and create a work environment that people are pleased with. So when we look at this from the lens of remote work, in my book, I talk a bit about how remote work, it's now table stakes. This isn't a perk. This isn't something that you're going to say, hey, if you do a good job, or after you've been here for a while and I trust you, I might let you work remote some of the time. That is going to be one of the elements that that creates issues, dissatisfaction, because again, remote work opportunities are now table stakes. If instead we have scenarios where these elements are present and we have well-structured remote work policies and supporting elements such as good onboarding, a culture that supports remote work, a culture that helps engender that flexibility and embraces it, that's going to create satisfaction. Again, remote work is now table stakes. So if you have a coherent policy, you have leadership that understands how to make it work effectively and embraces it, you're going to have higher employee satisfaction, less turnover, and it's going to be a recruiting tool. What that means in many cases, again, from a leadership perspective, is setting a common expectation that we as leaders are assuming the best intentions from people. This gets back to the theory why. This gets back to the Hertzberg theory in that if we have an environment where people know that they're trusted, where you have an expectation, hey, people want to do what they're supposed to do, and given that opportunity and free of impediments, they're going to get things done. That's the environment that you want to create. Clearly, because as experienced leaders, we know that there are going to be exceptions. That's where you focus your attention. And it's no different in a remote or remote hybrid work setting. When you create this environment and you set these appropriate expectations, you create that flexibility, you create a remote work policy that makes sense and make it available to everybody, then if you do have exceptions, you focus your energy on that. You don't start by creating as restrictive and defined a policy as possible to try to catch every single edge case and hope that by so doing, you prevent these exceptions. Because again, that's just going to be too unwieldy and too restrictive. Think about your hiring practices. Again, a few moments ago, I noted that it's really important to hire somebody that you would trust across the room or across the country. And this gets into other attributes that we're thinking about when it comes to hiring. If you think about reading resume descriptions or even job descriptions where the ideal person is the motivated self-starter, or people who describe themselves as motivated self-starters. Yes, that's exactly what we're looking for. And again, that's the kind of person you look for no matter what your work environment, remote or not. You ideally want to hire motivated self-starters. It becomes even more critical when we're looking to build a successful remote work culture, because again, we need people who have a positive attitude, who enjoy work, that's looking forward to assignments. They're problem solvers. They are lifelong learners. So not only do they come in with whatever degree of experience, or maybe less than ideal, but they have that great attitude, and they have an aptitude for learning. They have an aptitude for looking at an assignment and going, I'm going to figure out how to get that done with as little direction as possible, and I'm going to go get it done. Because again, in a remote environment, you're not necessarily going to be able to walk over to your manager's office and ask questions, or lean over somebody's cubicle. Yes, we have created the digital equivalent of that. Slack, Teams, Skype, long before the pandemic, other tools that enable immediate communication kind of create that digital equivalent of being able to pop in an office or lean over a cubicle. However, one of the things we also want to build towards for effective remote work and remote distributed teams is asynchronous work. And I'm going to touch on that in a few minutes. So the people who are hired with that combination of motivated self-starter, attitude, aptitude, are also going to be the people who are going to function more independently in this remote work environment. It's important that, much like when we're in the office, but even more critically when we're talking about remote and remote hybrid environments, we're working intentionally as leaders to maintain one-to-one connections with people, and we're also working to build one-to-many connections. What do I mean by that? If you're a leader or a manager, the odds are that you're doing one-to-one meetings with your direct reports. That's a practice you should be doing no matter what your work environment. Certainly something that I found, and I know others found effective during a forced period of remote work, to maintain those personal connections with the people you work with. Previous career, when I was part of a remote first company, those one-to-one conversations were, again, they were ingrained, they were expected. The other conversations and relationships that were critical are those one-to-many. In other words, if you're a leader, forming relationships with your teams, forming relationships with other teams, encouraging teams to form relationships with one another. In remote hybrid settings, these relationships are absolutely critical to ensuring that your culture, your workforce, your ability to execute and excel are all there and things are going to get done. Again, trust is the currency of the realm here. And so as we think about possible cultural change to help enable our ability to take advantage of remote and remote hybrid scenarios, to create environments in which this can be successful, the bottom line is we have to have environments of trust and accountability. Those two things go hand in hand. If I trust a person or I trust the team to get a thing done, that's one thing. I'm also going to hold them accountable for getting that thing done. They go hand in hand. And when we create that culture that, hey, I'm giving you the flexibility you need to work remotely, to determine the best way to accomplish your tasks, to potentially work asynchronously, I'm also going to be holding you accountable for the results that we've agreed upon, that we've made completely clear and transparent. It's important that any remote work policies and guidance that gets developed in an organization is flexible enough to accommodate different scenarios. As somebody who helped develop remote work policy for my own organization, we had to take into account a number of different factors. And there's a balance between making sure that the overall interests of the organization, the ability to manage, the ability to do certain things that HR professionals need to do, that managers need to do, that's all present. And at the same time, we're recognizing that different groups and individuals are going to have different and individual scenarios with regard to remote work. Your policy should enable you to allow, based on jobs, based on appropriateness, groups of people, individuals to work in complete remote scenarios, people to choose hybrid scenarios, whatever is most appropriate. The policy that you develop should be flexible enough to account for that. And certainly this is true for the systems that are going to support remote work. One of the things, again, I'm a technology leader, so in higher ed and in many other verticals, we had our breakout moment when we had to pivot for the pandemic. If we had good systems in place, those systems certainly got tested, but they also proved out that we have the infrastructure and we have the tools that are necessary to support remote teams. We, in many cases, had to evolve rapidly and iterate to get some of these things optimized to support long-term remote work. If you've worked in an organization that was born that way, one of the things you did as part of your maturing process was to develop those types of systems as part of your growth. So you were probably a cloud-first organization, cloud storage, cloud tools, software as a service, platforms, that sort of thing. This is important to think about as we determine how are we going to evolve and thrive as an organization that is now going to embrace remote or remote hybrid work settings. Some of the systems and processes that enabled us to be successful prior to that may not be most appropriate and most efficient as we look ahead to a world where many, most, all, some of our teams are working in remote scenarios. So that gets us to the tools. If you are providing everything for your teams, make sure that the technical tools and other tools are optimized for remote work. Many organizations choose to give people a stipend in order to set up a remote office. Whatever the amount of money is, whatever it can be used for, can vary from organization to organization. Whatever your decision is, make sure that you're taking into account, yeah, we're going to have people who are working remotely most of the time, some of the time, what have you, and we want to make sure that their technology tools and platforms are never an impediment. If you're going to have scenarios where people are coming back to the office for periods of time, often these are known as, hoteling spaces, make sure that those spaces are set up so that somebody can walk in, plug their laptop in, have a second monitor, have a power supply potentially in case they forgot theirs, so that we're not spending any time going, oh, I'm not as productive because I don't have my second screen or I forgot my power supply. Great examples of this that I have worked in myself offices designed with hoteling desks that have power supplies for Macs and PCs, that have a minimum 21-inch monitor that can be quickly positioned to the right or left of where a person likes to sit in their preference alongside of their laptop. These are just a few examples. Making sure, again, that people have that second monitor in their home office. Just a few. There are so many other areas that we could touch on in terms of things to do to make sure that your people and your organization will thrive as we think about post-COVID remote hybrid work scenarios. One of the things that we, again, saw pre-pandemic in many scenarios, it was certainly part of my own experience, and some organizations got a chance to experiment with during the pandemic, are what for years I've called distributed teams. I've been teaching a class for University of Wisconsin Platteville in their Master of Science in Project Management program that focuses on leading and managing remote, distributed, and co-located project teams. So it's really, we call it the Teams course for short, but we spend a fair amount of time discussing different techniques, management practices, organizational practices that are focused on the distributed team, including the globally distributed team. One of the things that remote work scenarios enable is getting away from being bound by time zones. It gets us into a scenario where we can consider asynchronous work and asynchronous communication. What do I mean by that? Plenty of organizations have been doing this for decades, where work literally moves with the sun around the globe. Teams in one country, one time zone may be doing work. They may be preparing artifacts and deliverables that then are picked up by a team in another time zone, and then just continues. We can be intentional about this as we evolve our organizations to take advantage of remote work scenarios. The idea that we all have to be working at the same time in order to accomplish things is outmoded thinking. I've experienced this myself, and plenty of other organizations have been very successful in this way. Channels and systems like Slack and Teams, and of course existing tools like email, cloud storage, collaborative document management systems. If you're developing software or other technical deliverables, you may be very used to this. The work all resides in one centralized place, and we don't have to be digitally or physically present to work with it in order to be effective. Certain organizations, I'll give you one example, I refer to this in my book, Automatic. This is the company that makes WordPress, the most popular web content management system in the world, has been doing asynchronous work for pretty much their entire existence, where they have continuous threads of communication going in Slack, where artifacts for products and related elements being worked on reside in a central location, and people work on them at times that best suit their productivity, that are best suit their flexible schedule, and there isn't a need for people to congregate, again, physically or digitally between some prescribed times. This frees us from time-bound work. This frees us from time zones. This frees us from defining work as something that has to happen between 8 and 5 or whatever, and instead provides additional opportunities for people to be effective when and where they do their best work. The same opportunities and capabilities that put us in scenarios where we can do these asynchronous teams, where we can have global distributed remote teams, also means that we have to raise our game when it comes to cultural awareness. It means that if, for example, you are an American and you constantly use phrases like, well, that's just basic blocking and tackling, or we need to raise the stakes on this, or what have you, people in other countries and cultures may have no idea what you're talking about. Something to consider. When we're working across distributed teams, especially multicultural teams, try to purge that language from your vernacular. Make sure, this is a critical thing that I've been talking about with a lot of people quite a bit recently, and even as recently as yesterday in some internal meetings in my workplace. When we are setting up meetings where we know that there are going to be people who are physically and digitally present and potentially joining from different locations and different cultures, it's critical that we are intentional about avoiding insider and outsider dynamics. What do I mean by that? Think about this. You are physically present in a conference room and a meeting is about to start, and you just spun up the conferencing system, people are joining digitally, cameras on, and there's all kinds of sidebar conversations going and laughter. People who are joining remotely have no idea what's being talked about. Immediately, there is an outsider dynamic created. The people in the room somehow have a relationship that the people joining digitally can't participate in. We have to intentionally avoid that as part of our ongoing leadership and coordination. That's really, really important. One of the things I note in my book is the necessity of developing human antenna in remote settings. This is where having multiple channels of communication, cameras on as well as sound, and also looking at tone and written communications is very important and very helpful. That human antenna helps us pick up, even when we're not physically present in the room with somebody, how they're feeling, what does their body language say about how they're receiving a message, what does their body language say about their mood, their facial expression, that sort of thing. I like to use an example of a coworker of mine, and this actually goes back quite some time, but again, this was a global distributed team. This person was located in Germany, and for quite some time, we communicated with this person exclusively by conference phone. And some people had developed the impression that this person was humorless and stern. When we had a chance to meet this person, because we did some co-located team activities, and then we had set up some conference systems that enabled us to see this person's expressions, we realized that this person, when you added the facial expressions to their voice, they were actually very warm, they were very friendly. And it was the fact that English wasn't their first language, along with the lack of that additional communication channel, that caused people to interpret them as somewhat cold and stern. Just one thing, one example to be cognizant of. We as Americans need to be very cognizant of our cultural tendencies. There's a lot of research, a lot of literature, scholarship around this that look at the American way of doing business. And when we are working across multiple cultures in distributed teams, we have to be cognizant of the different paces of business, the different value systems that other cultures have that are different from what American business people and organizational people tend to assume as norms and even often impose upon others. One of the most effective things you can do as a distributed team is to bring people physically together periodically. In my book, I talk about examples from my own past where the software development organization I led, every time we had a major release, we would bring everybody together in Chicago for a week of celebration, review of the work we just completed, training and updates for other parts of the organization, and then we'd spend the last couple of days planning and kicking off our next release. That in-person meeting, that celebration of the work that we just accomplished, helped to reestablish those relationships. Remember, we just spent 3 to 4 months working, almost exclusively remote. And so getting back together, reestablishing those contacts really helped the team morale, really helped to establish and firm and extend those relationships that sustained us when we then went back and worked apart for long periods of time. Again, these are just lots and lots of different ideas, and there are many, many more that can certainly be helpful and valuable when it comes to setting ourselves up for success in remote, hybrid, and distributed teamwork scenarios. We are at a point where we can begin to take questions and get into some discussion here in our session. We've got ample time to do so. So I want to open it up to questions and get a discussion going.
Thank you, Shawn. We actually had a few questions come in, and before we get to those, I just want to reiterate to everybody that the presentation today is being recorded, so you will receive a follow-up email from us with a link to that recording. But with that said, Shawn, can you tell me what are some ways that remote organizations foster teamwork and culture when they are mostly working remotely?
Great question. To me, this starts with your hiring and onboarding practices. To give you some examples, my own experience, I joined an organization in 2012 that was born remote, and the initial interview process, I mean, kind of like any other, the phone screen, of course. But then when I went in for some in-person interviews, there was a mix of in-person and remote interviews as part of that process. So the person who became my boss interviewed me, I think, from either Kansas or Utah. And then when I was hired, the onboarding process was optimized to be done remotely. Again, completely online and cloud systems for everything from HR systems, benefits. The platform we built on was remote and cloud-based. So it's really about building onboarding processes that set the stage. One, you're part of our team and we're glad you're here. I got great swag when I joined that organization. I also see that as a commonality with a lot of organizations that are remote first. They send out swag and gear, clothing, hats, backpacks to their new employees as a way of saying welcome and getting them equipped. And then establishing these norms and patterns to maintain those connections. So again, example from my past, even though the company was remote first, every month we had an all hands meeting. There were some people who would be present in what at that time was a corporate office in Deerfield, Illinois, but then the rest of the organization would be joining remotely. Everything about that all hands meeting was optimized to be maximum inclusive of the people who were remote. The founder of this organization had an open door policy. If you were a remote employee and at any point you felt like coming into the office to reconnect with people, you could do it. No questions asked. Just, hey, I want to fly in and I want to work in the office for a few days and just be around some of the other folks. The other thing is to be absolutely intentional about creating a culture and a work environment that always makes sure you're thinking of the remote people first and never doing anything from a cultural or leadership perspective that would make them feel like they're missing out on something. Like, wow, the folks back in the corporate office really seem to be doing this thing or having this fun or this connection that I'm missing. As leaders, creating or fostering that culture, we have to be intentional to prevent that from happening. Just a few ideas.
Thanks, Shawn. So there are certain types of organizations, maybe like manufacturing, that where there might be a mindset that they're not a tech company or a finance company, and we can't do 100% remote roles. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, there's no question. And again, I think that's kind of a stage setting thing for us here in the webinar, and it is something I address in my book. There are absolutely jobs, professions that require physical presence. If it's manufacturing where people are using their hands to either assemble something or to somehow administer machines, and you just can't do it remotely, we have to accept that. I think that this question may be getting at the scenario where part of our workforce cannot do their work remotely and part of our workforce can. How do we deal with that? And I think you have to confront it head on. I mean, that's what I'm doing. I work in IT, and so I have a good portion of our organization that in order to service somebody with a broken laptop or to go into a room where there's a piece of equipment that's not functioning properly, they have to be physically present. We have to maintain a physical help desk for that. We have engineers that have to come in to work on specific systems. We also have a significant portion of our workforce that can do all of their jobs remotely. Is that fair? I would say yes, in that we all follow our careers in different ways, and if it happened that your career is one that evolves such that you got to touch your work in order to do it, that's what it is. But we also have to be open and transparent about that and say, yeah, we're going to have in one team, one organization, we're going to have cohorts of people that really need to be present to do their work effectively. We're going to have cohorts that don't, and we're going to have to manage that and be open and transparent about it.
Great feedback, Shawn. We've been having a lot of conversations with employers where they're in the mindset of thinking about the remote employee life cycle. So everything from recruitment all the way to retirement and that life cycle of being completely remote. Can you provide some tips for onboarding those remote employees?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing to look at, there's a couple different perspectives. Certainly from a systems perspective, it's got to be as friction-free as possible. I have worked in at least one remote organization where to onboard, you did have to come to the office once because I don't remember why anymore, but over time, we got rid of that. I mean, assuming that, hey, welcome to the organization. Showing up in a package on your doorstep very soon will be your laptop. Maybe we're shipping you a monitor, or we're going to deposit some funds so you can buy whatever you need for your home office. Once you establish your identity through this initial HR system, you will be able to access email, cloud storage, other cloud systems, or other business systems that enable you to do your job. We're going to set you up with a work buddy, a remote work buddy, or other mentor that's going to help you onboard, that's going to be your resource to show you, hey, this is where we put things digitally. This is how we use our Slack channels or our team channels to communicate with one another. As part of onboarding, and once we establish your digital identity, you're automatically signed up for the channels that are part and parcel to the team or work that you're doing. When you talk about recruitment to retirement, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book, and we've talked about in the previous webinar, is remote workforce enables you to recruit literally globally if it's appropriate to your organization. And so recruitment on one hand means you're not geographically restricted. You can hire the best people wherever they are. It does bring with it, and again, people in payroll and HR are going to be close to this. Yes, we have to deal with different state regulations and that sort of thing, but the advantages of being able to hire globally if necessary, or at minimum regionally and nationally, can far outweigh some of those things. When I joined the organization I spent the most remote time working with, the head of HR very matter-of-factly and transparently just created the expectation that, yeah, I'm not going to work there forever, and that's okay. And the expectation that, yes, at some point in your career with us, it will be appropriate for you to transition into the next thing, and we support that. We want you to be as successful as possible here, and we're going to do everything we can to foster that.
Thank you, Shawn. Those are some great recommendations. So on one hand, we have the employees that are coming in to the organization working remotely. What about those employees that are already here and maybe they're transitioning to working remotely? What are some tips for organizations to help those employees that may have not worked remotely in the past be successful?
Yeah, great question. What I did, and again, I was fortunate as a leader, is that I had some lived experience that I could share with people. But what I think is critical is to point out, the flexibility and expectations. There's a couple of lenses to view this through. Potentially the lens of the person who is excited about the opportunity to work remotely. Maybe they adjusted in a so-so way during the pandemic, and now we're looking forward to, yeah, I can continue to do this. But what does it mean to me? If they adjusted well during the pandemic, then hey, keep doing what you were doing. That worked out really well. If they struggled with it, if they somehow, like I always felt like I had screen fatigue because, and here's an example. I had to prove I was busy and working by being in meetings and in front of my screen 8 to 5 or 7 to 6 and responding to emails at all times of the day because I wasn't going into the office where people could see me working. So instead, I'm trying to make up for that by being, digitally over present. Stop. That's something, that's a great opportunity to coach that person and say, look, work takes a lot of different forms. It's okay to go and think. Again, in my book, I talk about, and I illustrate the case of, if I'm out for my morning walk or morning run, and 15 minutes into it, I've been thinking about a work problem and I come up with a solution. Am I working? I am. You're not. You have to encourage people to get out of the mindset that, hey, you're not being compensated for the fact that your person is present at a particular time or in a particular place. And again, I'm assuming a lot here. Obviously, there, as we just said a few moments ago, there are scenarios where that is exactly necessary. But that notwithstanding, it's your brain that we're compensating you for. We're rewarding you for your creativity, your knowledge, your ability to innovate and collaborate. And whether that takes place on a walk, whether that takes place on a conference call where you are audio only because you don't have to participate as much, but you can still listen. Whether that takes place asynchronously, that's what you need to do to encourage people to make that transition, to give them the freedom that, again, as long as you're doing what we need you to do, you're achieving those results, when and where that happens is not as important to me as the innovation, creativity, thoughtfulness, productivity that we can see with the flexibility you get from remote work.
Thanks, Shawn. I think we've come across this question a number of different times. We're sitting in a meeting or we're going into a meeting and the supervisor or manager says, I want to see everybody, and forces the issue of turning your camera on. Do you discourage you doing things like that, or how might we coach that supervisor to be a little bit more tactful?
Yeah, good point. This is a tricky question, and we saw a lot of this again in the early days of the pandemic. And again, I think it was a reaction from a number of different things. One, yes, the leader who wanted to see that the person was really there in front of the computer and that they weren't multitasking. In some cases, it was nothing to do with that. It was just, hey, I miss you. Part of the loss that we felt because we did have to separate suddenly. Well, at least I can see you and I can see all my coworkers. So there was this huge premium on, hey, turn your cameras on. And then you'll all remember this. There was the, oh, look, it's your cat, your dog. Isn't that cool? And it is cool. But then, and I'm part of this. It's like, wait a second. There's this thing called a phone. And we used to do a lot of effective work over that phone. Me calling Jeremiah, hey, Jeremiah, that thing we're working on together? How's that thing going? That thing's done? Great. My thing's done too. I'll send it to you. Have a great day. Bye. Right? That's okay. And I think there's this pressure like, oh, it's got to be a Zoom call so I can see you. Hold off. And then I think, one of the norms that I've seen some organizations settle into, and certainly that's the case where I work, is, all right, we're all, there's 25 people in a meeting. And when you're speaking, it would be great if you turned your camera on because then we're going to focus on you. We get it. I mean, speaking for myself, I can't sit for long periods of time. I get up and stretch. Nobody wants to watch me do that. I turn my camera off, right? So the thing I think we need to settle on and establish some norms and expectations is, when is it appropriate? When is it absolutely helpful for us to have the multi-channel communication so you can see my facial expression, the body language that goes with the words coming out of my mouth or the document that you might be reading, and when is that not necessary? And again, I speak to this in my book, and I've spoken to it with lots and lots of people. I hope and see that we can get back to pick up the phone and call a person, because this just needs to be a quick phone call, and it's more effective than scheduling a Teams meeting, Zoom meeting, in-person meeting, email, or whatever. Just call me. So finding balance, I think, is going to be really important.
Thank you, Shawn. We have time for about one more question. And kind of wondering, do you have any strategies that would help staff to adapt to returning to the office after COVID, especially considering that more experienced staff versus less experienced staff might be coming from different backgrounds or different perspectives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe one of the context or drivers to that question is the recognition that we have 4 generations in the workplace right now, and pandemic or not, remote work or not, people have different expectations of work and what is appropriate and expected based on their generational experience and norms. And so as we think about returning and we think about providing this flexibility, this remote hybrid scenario, we're going to need to acknowledge that. So more experienced people coming back into the office, and maybe they have the assumption that, well, if I'm back and I'm gonna kind of get back to being here 8 to 5, that's what everybody's going to do, or at least they're going to be available 8 to 5. And so one of the things that we as leaders need to do is be very intentional about setting those things, setting up some of those guidelines, that balance between maximum flexibility, but then also acknowledging, all right, is it going to be most effective for this team to at least have some core work hours? Are we going to need to broker some conversations between the, and I'm speaking for myself, so I get to say this, the mid-50s something who maybe has more of a 8 to 5 culture, even if I'm working remotely, and somebody from a younger generation who's used to this, they're a digital native, used to this total flexibility. We're going to need to broker those conversations and establish some norms. We're also going to need to, the same grace that we showed as we pivoted together to a fully remote environment that many people weren't ready for, we're gonna have to have that same grace as we work out the return. And that's certainly my message as a leader to my leaders and colleagues is, let's do our best to establish some norms for that return and provide people with that guidance, and at the same time ask for and offer the grace that we're going to be working some things out as we return and figure out what the path ahead looks like.
Thank you so much, Shawn, and thank you for sharing your expertise today. I know we all very much appreciate it. And thank you so much to everybody that participated in today's webinar. We truly appreciate your support. There were a number of questions about specifics to, well, how do I figure out what position should be remote, and asking for additional one-on-one assistance. If you're interested in getting additional support implementing your remote or hybrid work plans, we at the Wisconsin School Business Center for Professional and Executive Development are happy to work with you to conduct a work environment audit, co-design educational opportunities to better prepare your team, and support you in the creation of remote and hybrid workplace strategies. The link on the screen below will help you set up a discovery session with our team. Thank you so much, and thank you again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.